Good afternoon and welcome to today's session. We're really pleased to have Joe Powell with us, a longtime pioneer of transparency and accountability. Joe serves as the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnership, which he's been with since 2011, I think, 2012, about when it started. And so he has an amazing view on the growth of this unusual organization that he's going to talk to us about. Prior to OGP, Joe was the Senior Policy and Advocacy Manager for the One campaign, where he was also working on increasing transparency. So he's bringing a ton of experience working, frankly, around the world on these issues to talk about what is, in a negative term, the anti-corruption movement, but what is really a movement around transparency and accountability. So welcome, Joe. Joe's joining us from the UK. We're a little bit later your time. We're just past the 10th now, heading towards the 11th anniversary of the creation of OGP. Talk to us about what OGP is and its unusual platform for both government and civil society, any relevant background, but also how it's evolved over the last 10, 11 years, and what the trends that you're seeing in the transparency and accountability movement.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah, for inviting me, and good to be with all of you. So yeah, OGP, the Open Government Partnership, was initially an idea that emanated from the Obama administration in 2011, which built on one of the first, I think, executive orders that President Obama had made on open government within his administration. And the idea was really to bring together an interesting mix of countries who didn't necessarily always see eye to eye in other multilateral spaces, but could cooperate on what this idea of what government is really for, which is, in Obama's words, was serving citizens rather than the other way around, serving itself. So we had a really interesting mix at the time of founding countries, including Mexico and Brazil and South Africa, Indonesia, Philippines, Norway, UK. But the other unique thing right at the start was it wasn't just heads of state that founded the organization. It was also a group of civil society leaders, many of whom were anti-corruption activists in their country. So there was a strong kind of signaling at the outset that these issues should not just be intergovernmental, but they should be with civil society and even sort of citizen movements at the table. And the theory behind it was that governments don't have all of the wisdom themselves, and often reformers in government find allies outside of government to get things done. And anyone who's worked in a big bureaucracy will know that often it's your internal fights when you're actually looking for those external allies to help you. And that was kind of this model around OGP that started. So although the name says Open Government Partnership, right from the outset, it's also, I think, important to clarify the term, because what we're talking about is not just transparency or open data or access to information, but we're really talking about a system of government where, yes, government is more open, but also citizens are able to participate. So they're invited into the decision-making process at national and local level. And also there is accountability for when either there's corruption or accountability for delivery for government. So it's transparency, accountability, participation is how we define open government. And it's not just the transparency side. So that was kind of some of the sort of founding principles. I guess just a few trends in terms of the last 10 years. I mean, we as an organization have grown very rapidly. So we had 8 founding countries and we now have 77. We have over 100 local and subnational governments. And our kind of mechanism has generated lots of reforms that are really interesting that we can talk about. But unfortunately, the counter trend of the entire existence of our organization has been this rise of authoritarian government, attacks on civic space and civil society, restrictions on free media, attacks on judiciary. I'm sure lots of things you've talked about in this course. And so we kind of see ourselves at an inflection point where we have some of the really interesting reforms that we think could actually be the ingredients of what a better democracy might look like. And yet at the same time, the geopolitics has very much been this rising group of countries which very much do not agree with open government. And so we sort of feel that tension very strongly in the first 10 years of OGP. The only other trend I'll mention is the point on national and local. So I think often when open government can be a very abstract concept. There's a TV show called Yes Minister. I don't know why I thought of that just now, but anyway, it's a sort of 70s, 80s British political show, and there's an episode called Open Government, and everyone agrees with open government. You can't possibly disagree with it. And so the reality is then that nothing actually happens, nothing changes. And so one of the reasons we had invited cities like LA and Austin and subnational provinces and counties is because it's where the direct citizen engagement often happens on things like public services. So it's not just the big legislative reforms like access to information or anti-corruption, but it's actually directly, how does my voice as a citizen impact the quality and type of services I receive, and are we having a say in what those are? And so we've seen at the local level those direct citizen participation examples, like the example I like from Austin is where they invited homeless people in Austin to be part of setting homeless policy in Austin. And homelessness is obviously a big problem in Austin, where you have rising house prices, a lot of inequality, but actually the homeless people are very rarely consulted on what they actually need and want from their local government. So that's just one example of what that would look like in practice.
Right. Let me pull out some threads because this is really helpful. I mean, that this issue of asking homeless to engage on a policy is what I think of as a best practice in development happening everywhere, not just in the global south, as we know from the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a lot of overlap between OGP and your embrace of the SDGs, including at the local level. When I first became acquainted with OGP during the launch of OGP, you're right, it was a little bit hard to get my head around, but there were a couple examples that I thought were really helpful. One was the idea of I paid a bribe. That moved from India to Kenya and then Ukraine, where maybe you can talk about that for a second, or also at the local level. And the use of technology is very sort of integral to a lot of this, right? I can't remember the exact title, but see, click, fix. If you had, a pothole down the street and wanting to get local government to be able to respond. If you can talk about those two examples before we go to some other highlights, that would be helpful.
For sure, and they're both good practical examples. So I think, I paid a bribe is essentially a system where citizens can directly report where they have experienced kind of low-level petty corruption in a way that is outside of the formal channels, which most citizens wouldn't trust because they themselves think those are corrupt. So in a sense, it's a kind of civil society or NGO actor trying to play the role of almost a mediator between citizen and the state in a low trust kind of environment where petty bribery is endemic. And what that does is it illustrates the level of the problem, because often it's very hard to actually get a sense of how prevalent that sort of bribery is. But it also is clearly a good advocacy tool to senior people in government to actually resolve it, and has been the basis of actual, almost movement generation of people feeling, that they're not alone in this. And yet, of course, people anecdotally know, but when you see the scale of it, it can help bring people together. And the example in the UK, it's called Fix My Street, but there's variants of this in many different countries. Is again the kind of brokering role of let's say potholes or people's trash not being collected, or graffiti, things that directly affect your local environment. And again, often local government has a reputation of being quite unresponsive in terms of resolving those issues, which can have a real impact on your lived environment and affect people's quality of life. So Fix My Street or its equivalent is again about creating it's a tech platform, it's a website or an app where you can report a local level issue that you care about. And then the thing that they've done, actually, I had this discussion with the governor of Jakarta when we were there. They then have a traffic light system on resolution. And the reason that is clever is not just about me as a citizen understanding that pothole has been filled in, but it's also useful for reformers in government to hold their own bureaucracies to account to demonstrate that they're actually delivering for people. And so it kind of works both ways.
Right. I mean, I think it is really critical for people to understand this is fundamentally a call to reformers who are inside government to help them, as well as giving a platform for civil society and citizens. And to that extent, it is really a unique coming together, this multi-stakeholder voluntary organization. We are living in gloomy times. As you said, the entire time OGP has been in existence, there have been very strong headwinds. I remember a meeting, I think it was in Long Island somewhere, of the Transparency and Accountability Network, and everybody was sort of waxing eloquent about the openness, and I sort of raised my hand tentatively to say, there is this other counter movement on closing space. This was around the time, I think, that USAID had been ordered to shut down in 20 days after 20 years by the Putin government. And of course, this is an epidemic that's gone around the world where civil society, journalists, philanthropy, frankly, anybody from the outside, oftentimes trying to shine a light, has been called out, making it very difficult. And of course, we're living in particularly gloomy times. But can you talk a little bit more about some highlights, citizen movements and various country highlights, just to counter the gloom?
Yeah, sometimes difficult not to be gloomy, but yeah, I think maybe just a few examples is helpful. I mean, we have each year the Open Government Partnership has a lead chair government and a chair civil society leader. And last year our chair government was South Korea. Interestingly, the last Korean government, so government led by President Moon, came to power off the back of a citizen movement focused on corruption. So it was called the Candlelight Revolution, and there was a major corruption scandal with the previous president and her relationship with some of the big conglomerates in Korea who are very powerful politically. And it brought out some of the biggest protests the country's ever seen, and actually led to the downfall of that government. But the thing that is, I think, really interesting about it is when the new administration came in, they decided not just to, that they understood that they'd come to power off the back of the citizen movement, but they then wanted to channel that energy into their own administration. So they created something called the Gwanghwamun Square Initiative that evolved into a different name later on, but basically was a way in which those citizens that had been involved could then make proposals to the new government directly on what they should be doing. And those often were very local level things, so the type of things we were just talking about, but also some structural reforms. And so I like this idea of how citizen movements don't just stop when you get the election result you want or the leader you didn't like replaced. And it's often very hard to do, to keep the momentum going, even after the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, a lot of the same issues, right? Which is how do you keep that energy and focus going? So I think it's a combination of then trying to channel that into policy, but also trying to keep the new governments honest, or hold them to account. So I mean, in terms of other countries right now, I think we're having a meeting later this month in the Dominican Republic, where there's a really reform-minded government who we're working closely with. In Moldova, obviously right on the border with Ukraine and also experiencing a lot of Russian aggression, but they're really trying to do a lot of work on corruption and openness. Malawi, and again, new president who seems to be a breath of fresh air. So Yeah, to me, it often doesn't make the headlines, but there are countries going in the right direction who are trying to tackle corruption and build democracy. And actually, that's where I think, frankly, an organization like ours can have the most impact. Is how do you support when those reformers are in power? How can you support them quickly to deliver to their citizens in a way that shows impact and will help them hopefully get re-elected or stay in power in the face of all of those trends Sarah you talked about?
I do think that this is a best practice in terms of supporting democracy or building resilience against authoritarian trends. And the idea of going to places that where there's citizen movement, where there's some reformers in government, where, as one colleague used to put it, gas in an already moving car, that's where you see the real movement. So I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, and there's an academic called Brian Levy who describes it as going with the grain. Essentially, it's especially on anti-corruption. There are things that we can do when corrupt leaders are in power to hold them to account and prevent things getting even worse. And we've all experienced that in all our countries. But there are also things we the really exciting moments where you feel like you have that momentum and you have people in and outside the government working collaboratively. I think that it's maximizing those windows of opportunity.
In the toolkit of how to get things done, this idea of external allies is really important, or internal allies, depending on where you're sitting. I want to welcome again folks to the Zoom. We're with Joe Powell. We're gonna be coming to you shortly, so please tee up your questions. If you want to get your hand up, that's fine. If you want to drop a question in the chat, that's also fine. We're going to continue a conversation for a bit before turning to others. Corruption really is, though, this kind of secret sauce, a motivator for public outcry. You mentioned Korea, you mentioned Ukraine, Tunisia comes to mind. It absolutely can change governments. Now, there's also enabling behavior, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This isn't just an issue of corruption happening in authoritarian governments. There's all sorts of ways in which in high-income countries, however unevenly developed, that there is enabling environments. But why do you think it is that corruption speaks so much to publics around the world? And then, of course, I see this as absolutely integral to Vladimir Putin being allergic to Ukraine independence, that it really goes to some kind of visceral issue for him.
I mean, exactly. I think it's the direct link to growing inequality that we've seen in most countries, not everywhere, but most countries, I think is a key factor. And the capture of the state in a way that means that people don't feel like there's any kind of level playing field, and that's why the example of contracts and procurement, although it's quite a technical issue, it is where government spends most of its money. And if you take Hungary as an example, Viktor Orban has become an expert in capturing state procurement for political ends. And what that does is it means if you're a company or a small enterprise trying to get a contract from the Hungarian government, all your incentives are aligned to being a supporter of Viktor Orban rather than independent-minded. So I think the kind of, for me, links to this idea of a level playing field, this idea that more and more wealth has been centralized among a small elite. Most of that money is then siphoned off, as we know, offshore. So I think it's, and if you look back to Tunisia, yes, that again, the Tunisian revolution was fundamentally about jobs and standard of living, but people knew that corruption was one of the main drivers of that. So I think it's this connection. So if you and the smartest campaigners and movements, I think, make that connection. So it's not just the billions and trillions that you see in the headlines. It's demonstrating, and we'll talk a bit about this later, maybe demonstrating very specifically to people why it matters to them. And then that, and I've always kind of been skeptical that you ever would have a citizen movement on open government, because it's too broad and abstract. But you can definitely build a citizen movement around tackling corruption, because it also just kind of, it makes people emotional because it's your money, right? Your money as taxpayers that is ultimately being siphoned off.
So there's a lot going on. Just today, I was noting to you that the Brookings Institution hosted a 2-hour seminar on what is beneficial ownership, and we'll talk about that in a second. I think there's also USAID is issued today the kleptocracy guide. Let's talk a little bit about the Biden administration, because the anti-corruption aspect has been really highlighted. Now, as you noted, OGP emerged from the Obama administration. This is not the first administration to focus on transparency, accountability, anti-corruption. But there's also a downside, which is, as much as OGP has been aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, the Biden administration has been a little bit ambivalent, I would say, or uneven. So on the one hand, robust about fighting corruption, but a bit uneven coming out supporting the SDGs. They're among a handful of countries, including Haiti, Myanmar, Yemen, South Sudan, that haven't issued a voluntary national review. Reviews are very important in the OGP process and holding accountable governments, and having sort of dashboards or stoplights to understand. And yet, on the other hand, the Biden administration has also been, or at least the president has been, very strong on advancing democracy, right? The Summit for Democracy, they're going to issue a second date, I understand, quite soon. How do you read the Biden administration's approach to all of this? Some applaud the elevation, others say, well, they're taking a very law enforcement approach on the anti-corruption piece. They're not looking at it in terms of systems and systemic change. Where do you come down on all this?
Well, I think first to give them credit, the steps that the Biden administration has taken on the US role as a facilitator of global corruption, there have been some really important steps. Some of them have gone through legislation. So you mentioned beneficial ownership, Sarah. So for the first time, law enforcement in the US will have access to a registry of who truly owns and controls companies, and that will be accompanied by enforcement. So if that information is false, there will be penalty. And the reason that's so important is because we know anonymous shell companies and companies that are owned in trusts and by kind of intermediaries are one of the main vehicles for corrupt money internationally, and for money laundering and terrorist financing and drug running and lots of other things that we would want to get rid of. And that is a very significant step forward in terms of domestic policy. So I think in terms of leading by example domestically, that is a big step forward. The weakness with the US approach on beneficial ownership is that, unlike in other countries, that information will not be public. And I guess that kind of goes to your point about, is this an enforcement issue, or is it really about giving citizens information and journalists and others to use that in interesting and creative ways? And unsurprisingly, as someone from the Open Government Partnership, we think that data should be made public, because we think there are lots of unintended benefits that come from releasing open data, in particular high data value sets like ones on company ownership. So maybe it's almost a microcosm of that tension. But on the Summit for Democracy overall, I do buy the argument that in recent years, authoritarian and closed governments have been more effective at learning from each other on innovative methods of doing that, right? So one of the classic examples has been these NGO laws that have many countries have now adopted a version of, which effectively restricts your ability to foreign funding. So people like Open Society Foundation and other funders can't actually support those organizations, make it harder to register, make it harder to do anything deemed in any way political, and basically stripping out the ability for civil society to operate independently. Similarly, there's been a lot of creative authoritarian learning on surveillance of civil society. And many of those activists that are being surveilled by technology that enables people to spy on phones are anti-corruption activists. And so that's not really a surprise to me. But again, there's been incredible spread of this technology that Pegasus, the Israeli company, initially developed and is now, I think now are actually banned in the US, I believe. So, and I think the company is going bankrupt. So anyway, so if you buy that argument that closed and authoritarian governments have got really good at learning from each other, then I do think having some spaces where countries that want to learn on openness and democracy is important. However, I do not think so far this Summit for Democracy idea of the administration has done that. I think, unfortunately, what can often happen in kind of democracy summits is you end up, and I'm just sort of speaking frankly, you end up with a lot of very vacuous speeches about how much people love democracy without anything underpinning it of how we're actually going to improve. And that's where things like the SDGs and the benchmarking and the reviewing come in. Because if you don't have that, it just becomes a talking shop. And so I think what we would like to see, and we're trying to help the administration do that, is to encourage any government that participates in a Summit for Democracy and a second Summit for Democracy next year to come with much more specific commitments and policy reforms that could actually meaningfully enhance democracy in those countries.
In a lot of ways, what you're talking about is upping the game around collective action and the creation of norms, and underpinning that with things like the benchmarking and the reviews so that you get real action. That would be very much, I would say, a 21st century way of merging diplomacy and support for development and new approaches to democracy promotion. I think I hear you. I also want to point out this transnational learning of authoritarians. It's also the case that there's a lot of transnational learning among civil society, and in some ways OGP, the civil society piece of OGP and the movement around anti-corruption and transparency and accountability are great showcases for that. But I agree with you that S4D, the Summit for Democracy, has the potential to be that collective action or dialogue that happens in an iterative way, not just at a summit, right? But that there's action going on between summits, that it counters that kind of authoritarian learning. I just worry that I don't know how many people see it that way, Joe, and I worry that there are too many countries that are not seeing it that way. I'm looking to figure out who are the allies, not in a legal sense, but we've been at OGP summits in Canada, we've been in the UK, elsewhere. Who could we be relying on to help really up the game and try and, because at this point I feel like civil society is carrying a lot of this. I mean, OGP and Brookings together are working to try and make the anti-corruption piece credible, real. You need a lift also from those inside government.
Yeah, exactly, and so you need both. So we are, as you said, we are co-chairing the anti-corruption track with the State Department and the Brookings Institution, and what we are trying to do with that is, it's very, very helpful to have a government champion on an issue like this, because as you said, without it, political leadership, it's almost like the ingredient that you can only do so much without it, right? You can do some really important things, but if you don't have that level of ministerial head of state engagement, there are some reforms that just won't happen. So I think what we're looking for is almost a, if the Biden administration is able to bring heads of state to a summit on democracy, then that is a very helpful step. But it's then so what after it, there has to be something underneath it, right, beyond just meeting. And to be fair to them, and again, this is a pandemic era issue, I do think that type of statecraft is much harder to do on Zoom. So the first Summit for Democracy was entirely virtual. And of what that means is you don't have no leader is listening to another leader, right? They've just pre-recorded a speech, submitted it. And so what you miss is that kind of, even at that very senior political level, people do get ideas from each other. And that part was entirely missing. So yeah, it's a really interesting question of how you sort of meld the statecraft, political leadership, summitry with the concreteness that you need to actually have something to follow through on. And yeah, I hope we can help them to deliver that for the second summit.
I mean, it's not only the leaders listening to other leaders, but it's also the unexpected running into people and the conversations in the corridor and the pull-asides and, that kind of thing that's missing. And it's very hard to do diplomacy without that. I can't imagine having to run a resolution in the General Assembly if we're not actually present. I mean, you really need to be corralling people and either asking them to vote with you or stay out of the hall, and you can't do that on Zoom. I see Ryan Shen has a question. I want to go to Ryan, and then I want to come back to you, Joe. You've run a really cool anti-corruption campaign more recently, and I want to hear about that. But Ryan, go ahead and ask your question. Let us know who you are and where you are, and go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, hi, Joe. It's really good to meet you. My name is Ryan. I'm a first-year student in the public policy program on the data analytics track. My question is in the same vein of program evaluation. How do you convince participating governments that the kind of program evaluation that your organization is supporting is significant compared to other types of program evaluation that government might concurrently be doing? As a bit of background, I've been working in the city of Pittsburgh's, one of the city of Pittsburgh's health services departments. So I'm aware of some of the troubles that go along with reforming the Bureau of Public Safety.
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, the most contentious issue at the founding of OGP was the setup of what we call our independent reporting mechanism, which basically gave the mandate to do an assessment of whether our members were actually implementing what they were doing, saying in their commitments to us. And that's not us doing it as a central group of staff. We hire local researchers to interview people, do the assessment, and so on. And obviously, those reports are something that some governments don't like, because it will say that they did not deliver on all of their commitments. And so I think what we've tried to do is not frame that how I just framed it, but frame it as much about learning as about accountability. Because I think often it's very difficult for governments to admit when they've not done something, or to have a genuine conversation about improvement, because the electoral incentives and other incentives are just not aligned to that. So I think what we've tried to position ourselves is kind of like, yes, we may be critical, but we're also going to offer suggestions and recommendations on how you can improve, and we'll actually support you to do that. So it doesn't feel like a kind of external evaluation in that sense, but it's something that's more of an ongoing learning tool. And I think, to your point about competing requirements, again, often for bureaucracies, these things can be seen as a pain, right? It's like it's getting in the way of us actually doing the work. So again, I think that's the learning emphasis and the practicality of the recommendations are hopefully that's the way in which we can kind of be seen as a useful partner in terms of evaluation and not just layering on kind of more bureaucracy?
So yes, it was a great question. And in a lot of ways, the OGP approach is you gather more with honey rather than vinegar, yeah? So that you are actually helping rather than constantly berating. And there are other models for NGOs where it is all about being negative against a state. Before I go to your really fabulous campaign and go back to other questions, there have been times that governments that are less interested in things open either have joined OGP or have almost joined OGP. I'm thinking about that moment where it looked like the Russian government was going to join OGP, and then all of a sudden someone actually mentioned it to Putin, and I think they said, "What are you talking about? Of course we're not." And then, of course, there's Azerbaijan. Can you just talk a little bit about the mechanism for, I guess, kicking out a government that is not living up to OGP?
Yeah, so we have a criteria for entry, which is a 4-part criteria of a degree of access to information, of budget transparency, of asset disclosure, and a kind of proxy that we use on civic space. So the first step is we try and make sure that countries that join at least meet a minimum threshold, and we do have countries that want to join who don't yet meet that threshold, and of course we try and support them to then meet it and join. But once a country is in, we have had countries join and leave OGP because, for political reasons. So Hungary and Turkey left, Tanzania left, although we're now hopeful under the new president that they'll rejoin. But we also have situations where countries want to stay in, but there is a serious challenge particularly to civic space, and that's our Azerbaijan example. So Azerbaijan does meet our criteria, and they have participated in OGP in the sense of delivering their commitments on time, but the civic space context for Azerbaijan has declined rapidly. Journalists have been locked up, and activists have had their funding restricted, and so on. So we have something called a response policy, which can be triggered when a situation like that emerges. And interestingly, in the case of Azerbaijan, local activists felt like it was too dangerous for them to have their name on the submission. So they worked with international NGOs, in this case, Publish What You Pay, Civicus, which is a big sort of civil society umbrella body, and Article 19, who work on freedom of information, to submit the paperwork to us. And then our steering committee, which is 11 governments and 11 civil society leaders, deliberated and ended up in essence suspending Azerbaijan from OGP, pending an improvement to the context. So I think the vast majority of OGP's incentives are aligned positively around learning, inspiration, and so on. But we do have, just a few sort of sticks, if you like, partly to maintain our own credibility, but also to try and, where we can, try and prevent that backsliding. But very, very difficult to do. And obviously for us, again, it's not just OGP, it's almost any international body that has criticized some of the more tricky kind of authoritarian leaders we've talked about in this chat. They're not necessarily going to listen to us, right, or any other international body. So we have to be, manage expectations about that. But...
Joe, let's talk a little bit about your campaign. And I see a question from Justin. Peter's dropped a question, and then Ryan says he has another one. But let's hear about your campaign, because it's really important to understand the enabling environment that some call Londongrad.
Yeah, so I actually I lived in Washington D.C. for 9 years, and last August moved back to London, where I'm from, and I have ended up living in a part of London where we have a very high proportion of our properties owned anonymously in those shell companies I talked about earlier. So we have over 6,000 properties registered overseas. Top two destinations are the British Virgin Islands and Jersey. And most of those companies are shell companies. So when the invasion of Ukraine happened, we also have the Ukrainian embassy in our area. So a lot of local residents were very generous with their time and support to refugees on the humanitarian effort. But we also thought that there's a systemic problem with London as a center of washing dirty money through our banks and other property and other structures. And it seemed to me like again, going back to this windows of opportunity, this issue was on the front pages of the papers. People were talking about it. So we launched a campaign called Kensington Against Dirty Money to really mobilize at the grassroots level residents and small businesses and local council members and charities and so on to basically say that as residents of this area, that is causing direct damage to us. So it's not just causing damage to the countries where that money has come from and eroding democracy there in places like Azerbaijan, but it's also hollowing out our communities because most of those properties are empty. They're just assets. It's increasing house prices for people who can't otherwise afford to buy property. This will be familiar, of course, to any, it's not just London, it's Miami, it's Vancouver, it's many other places. But also it's distorting the community, right? So it's having worked with OGP at a global level, I always think it's a good kind of challenge of like how do you connect these issues to people's direct concerns, and housing in London is obviously one of the biggest concerns people have because it's so unaffordable. So being able to make that link to dirty money and corruption has meant that we've had a lot of traction in this campaign and a lot of kind of media interest. And in fact, we managed to influence the government, who passed a law earlier this year that will for the first time create a public register of who owns and controls property in Britain. So at least with that register, we'll be able to ask the question whether these properties were bought with corrupt money. But also it means that if you're an activist in Azerbaijan, you are able to see for the first time the £600 million property empire that the Aliyev family have in Britain, and ask questions about where that money came from when the president's annual salary is £175,000. So it's that, at least at that first level, we've made some progress. There's a lot more to do on enforcement. Obviously, we'd like to see more money invested into social housing and housing people can actually afford. But anyway, good. I would love to see local anti-dirty money campaigns all over the world, because I think what it does is it complements the policy and advocacy work that technical experts like Brookings or whoever can do. But they aren't the organizations that can do that mobilization at the grassroots level. So you need both if you want change to happen.
Right. I mean, after all the policy work you've done, you do this campaign and all of a sudden the New York Times shows up and is covering it. I thought that was quite brilliant. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left and we have some folks with their hand up. I'm going to actually privilege Ibrahim because he is registered with the class and has spent a lot of time working with me over the summer on wishing that just recovery was occurring, but seeing a lot of unjust recovery. Ibrahim, let's go to you, and then we'll take a couple questions and then go back to Joe.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mendelson. And thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us, Joe. I just had a quick question when you were talking about anti-corruption. I mean, in case of London, in perspective with that regards, Pakistan itself has a lot of corruption issues when it comes to the state. I'm going to talk about in Pakistan's context. And since you mentioned London, there were Evanfield apartments. There's this area in London where one of the ousted prime ministers in Pakistan was allegedly supposed to have some very expensive apartments. And this became a whole thing a drive against corruption back home, where institutions like National Accountability Bureau and all of that came into play. But this is what my real question is: how do you ensure that institutions like these don't act on behalf of the current existing government, or are not used as tools like political victimization against other democratically elected parties? Or how do you go about it? Or what sort of mechanism, or what's the role or accountability for another accountability institution? How does the government go about it?
Joe, do you want to take that, or do you want to have Justin Poser ask his question?
Up to you.
Justin, let's hear from you if you're still have a question. Otherwise, we'll go with Ibrahim's. How do you make sure that you're not used as a tool against the current government? There's Justin.
Sure. I'll ask. Oh,
go ahead.
This was partially answered before, but I can ask it in a more full way now. Given a likely scenario in the future where we're seeing a lot of environmental migration, and again, as you mentioned before, like the tools of misinformation and surveillance becoming more and more available to governments that want to use them, isn't it sort of a likely scenario that we're going to see a lot more states that have been stable democracies or somewhat stable democracies backsliding or having complete changes of government that are much more corrupt and authoritarian? And as I think that you said a little bit about this, but maybe you can expand briefly, what can be done to sort of prevent that and get ahead of those changes that we can really see coming pretty clearly?
So why don't we stick with those two questions before going back to Peter's question that's dropped, and if Ryan still has a question, and if anybody else wants to get in, please raise your hand. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, the Pakistan example is a really good one because as you said, it was one of the governments that fell really due to these leaks, right, around company ownership and the Panama and Pandora Papers and so on. And as you said, it's you know, I have a list, an unverified list of properties in London owned by various political leaders around the world, and most of them obviously don't want that information to go back to their public. But I think just your point about corruption as a political weapon, obviously the language of corruption, I think this is incredibly interesting. I mean, it's a much longer conversation because it has been used by more populist authoritarian leaders in a way to sow distrust in government that suits their own political ends, right? And I'm not naming names here, but you can probably imagine who I'm alluding to. So we need to be very careful about that. So I think, and actually, I remember when one of the times I was in Ukraine, some of the politicians saying that the requirement for them to disclose their assets, although in theory a good anti-corruption tool, was sowing distrust in Ukrainian politics, because relatively those politicians were quite wealthy to the public, even if that was money that they'd earned legitimately. So I don't have a neat answer to this at all. I think in the long run, the openness creates a much stronger foundation and culture for a more fact-based public debate that hopefully is able to sort of have some rationality around it, around issues like that. But I absolutely accept your point that this kind of politicization and weaponization of corruption as a tool to go after political opponents is something that, unless you have a strong accountability branch, whether that's Parliament or the courts, to push back on that, there is obviously a risk of that manipulation. So again, I tend to sort of trust the public when they have the facts to come to the right conclusion, but obviously that is not the case in many places, and it's particularly with our media environment. And And by the way, just as an aside, Pakistan did join OGP briefly, but then unfortunately didn't do anything. And actually, it was under the Sharif government that Pakistan joined. And the incentives are quite interesting, because I think the government joined because they wanted to demonstrate to the international community, to donors, to others, that they were really a reform-minded government. And unfortunately, we got slightly caught in the politics of the moment, because when the government collapsed, the new government came in and thought, oh, this OGP thing, oh, that's a Sharif thing. We don't actually want to take it seriously, even though the foundation of the principles around it were ones that they could probably agree to. So we kind of got caught up in that political moment. But anyway, that's a sidetrack. To Justin's question, I think links to Peter's question about government use of technology against their citizens. I mean, this is, we set up a group in OGP on algorithmic accountability because absolutely this is one of the biggest trends that risks undermining democracy and everywhere. And so what we're trying to do with that group is, with governments, instill or promote a norm around government disclosure of when they use algorithms to make decisions. This is only a small part of this problem, but it's an illustration. So if you are using an algorithm to make criminal justice decisions or housing allocation decisions, or frankly anything, you should be required to disclose that algorithm, all the working behind it, so that people can interrogate it. And that interrogation may not be, it may be hard for citizens to do that themselves, but there are plenty of really good think tanks and academics that want to look into this. And by the way, it's the same information they want from Facebook and the other platforms around how they're operating. So I think, again, transparency to me is a start. Like, can we create a norm around disclosure of algorithms and how and the impact of them is a starting point. But again, it comes back to leadership, and unfortunately, these tools can be turned against people if that's what the political leaders want.
Well, if there's any way that Carnegie Mellon University can help on the algorithmic accountability, let us know. I think there are a lot of people who'd be quite interested. To Ryan's question that's dropped, that's a really good one. Joe, do you want to take that on?
Sure, and I was just going to name check Citizen Lab did some incredible work on Pegasus, which is the surveillance tool I mentioned earlier. I've just put also—
This is out of Toronto.
The career example separately, but also Citizen Lab. Yeah, they were the ones that were able to help analyze the phones of people who thought they'd been hacked and identify when and how it happened. Anyway, those two might be interesting links to look at. Yeah, on the question about having so we don't put ourselves in a position where we decide who from civil society should participate. We've always thought that is best thrashed out within civil society coalitions rather than us picking and choosing. So what that means is that we have some civil society coalitions, like in Nigeria, who are extremely well organized, very diverse group, really good at holding the government to account. We have others where it's kind of thin, and it's just a few elite-based capital city-based organizations who don't really have the ability to mobilize people. My view is that it should never be one organization, because you set yourself up to fail. I think that the way to do it well is to have really diverse national, local coalitions of civil society, and not civil society that only has anti-corruption in their title,
right,
but actually demonstrate why anti-corruption is important to the climate movement, or to the gender equality movement, or to Black Lives Matter, or to justice reformers, because actually open government and anti-corruption can be a tool to achieve those things. And so we have to, demonstrate why this is an approach that can apply to almost any topic that civil society wants to work on. And I think that's where we have a job to do, to not explain it in an overly technical way, which can often kind of obscure the wider goals that I think open government can help deliver.
Your description of this very rich, interconnected, for example, in the campaign that you're doing, of it touches on corruption, but also housing insecurity, housing affordability, building just inclusive communities. It's really critical. It's very difficult sometimes, both for OGP and the Sustainable Development Goals, to break down these acronyms and make it real for people. And yet, to my mind, these are absolutely relevant for whether you're focused on climate, COVID, conflict, or corruption. These things are really connected and extremely relevant. Joe, we could spend, another hour or two or a day with you. You've got lots to share. One last quick question. What is a metric for success for your campaign?
So it's funny because we're just really a loose group of local residents, and so it's all these questions about organizational learning and so on. It's kind of like it sort of went out the window because we just saw a political opportunity. It went for it. And I'll share also our website, Kensington Against Dirty Money. I think, look, the metric ultimately is we ourselves want to be part of those coalitions that I talked about. So right. We want to change policy. We've already had one national policy that we can say that we've contributed towards. So that obviously campaigners for many years have been pushing for it. We also, there's another national policy we want to see, which is basically enforcement, so a better enforcement agency on kleptocracy and corruption in London. And then locally, we'd like to see our council show more leadership on empty properties and the connection to dirty money. So I guess we're kind of focused on the outcome, the policy outcomes, but at the same time, I think if we can show people what this type of local coalition can do, I hope that will have a knock-on effect to other local issues, because I think people often feel like these things are so intractable. And so, I would love to see us kind of go into that housing topic I talked about earlier. So all that to say, as you can probably tell from my answer, we're very focused on policy change in the short term, and we don't have any donors to report to, so we'll stick on that, and then if hopefully we can evolve into some other issues as well.
No, it's a brilliant example of citizen action and voluntarism, and that's worth a lot of gold, actually. So listen, thank you so much, Joe, for spending the hour with us. Thanks everybody who was with us for the good questions, and we'll see you next week, same time on Zoom. We're going to be looking at the power of youth. We're joined by Susan Reichley, who heads the International Youth Foundation, and Kristen Lord, who heads IREX. I think it's going to be a dynamic conversation about more on civil society, but particularly why the generation that we see on the Zoom and around the world is particularly powerful and dynamic. So thank you very much. Thanks, Joe, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you, Sarah. Bye.